June 1944. The war in Europe had entered its final desperate phase. Allied armies were advancing across France, their victory in Normandy still fresh, their soldiers weary but resolute. In London, the people who had endured 5 long years of blackout and bombing were beginning to hope that the worst was behind them. The Luftwaffe had been broken. The night raids were over. Peace, perhaps, was finally within sight. But one morning, the sound returned. It was not the deep, thunderous roar of Heinkels or Dorniers. It was something altogether different. A low, droning buzz, mechanical and insect-like, that echoed through the early summer air. Those who heard it stopped in their tracks, confused, then fearful. Children pointed upward. The sound grew louder, pulsing, relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Moments later, the world erupted. The explosion tore through the stillness, flattening houses, hurling glass and debris through the streets of South London. The air filled with dust and screams. People who had survived the Blitz knew that silence was often deadlier than sound. The moment the noise of the buzz bomb ceased, they had learned to dive for cover. It was June 13, 1944, the day the first German V-1 flying bomb struck London. The weapon was a marvel of sinister ingenuity, officially called the Vergeltungswaffe 1, the Vengeance Weapon 1. It was designed not to defeat an army, but to terrorize an entire nation. Each V-1 carried nearly a ton of explosives and was launched from the French coast by a crude catapult, its small pulse-jet engine propelling it toward the British capital at over 400 miles per hour. It required no pilot, no mercy, and no emotion. To the Germans, it was vengeance for the Allied bombing of their cities, a mechanical answer to years of firestorms and rubble. To the British, it was something darker, a weapon that erased the boundary between soldier and civilian, a machine that killed without warning, without even the presence of a human being. The V-1 campaign began in waves. Day after day, the missiles streaked across the Channel, their engine note an eerie heartbeat above the clouds. London, Croydon, and Kent bore the brunt of their fury. Fires raged across the capital once again. For a people already scarred by war, it was a cruel revival of old nightmares. In the control rooms of Britain's anti-aircraft command, the reports came in faster than they could be tallied. The existing radar system could detect the incoming bombs, but stopping them was another matter. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to hit such fast, low-flying targets. Fighter pilots chased them, but the small, unmanned craft were hard to destroy and dangerous to approach. The first weeks were chaos. Air Marshal Sir Roderick Hill later recalled those days with grim honesty. It was like fighting ghosts. You could see them on the screens, hear them overhead, but by the time you fired, they were already gone. The government quickly mobilized every resource it had. Barrage balloons were repositioned to intercept the incoming bombs. The Royal Artillery moved hundreds of heavy guns to the southern coast. Squadrons of Spitfires, Tempests, and even early jet fighters were thrown into the fray. The British called it simply the Battle of the Flying Bombs. But in the early weeks, it seemed a hopeless contest. For every V-1 destroyed, several slipped through. Some were shot down only seconds before reaching their targets, their wreckage raining down over the countryside. Others dived into neighborhoods, their explosions reducing entire streets to rubble. And yet, behind the scenes, a quiet revolution was taking shape, one that would soon tilt the balance of this strange new war in the air. In secret laboratories across Britain and America, scientists had been working on an invention unlike any weapon the world had ever known. It was a tiny device, scarcely larger than a light bulb, yet it contained within it a principle that could change the course of battle. It was called the proximity fuse. The idea was both simple and extraordinary: to create a shell that could sense when it was near its target and detonate automatically. No longer would gunners have to rely on timing or direct hits. A shell fitted with a proximity fuse could explode at exactly the right moment. when its fragments would be most lethal. It was, in essence, the birth of intelligent weaponry. But in the summer of 1944, almost no one outside a handful of scientists and senior officers knew it existed. The technology was so secret that even many artillery crews using it did not understand how it worked. They were simply told it was a special fuse, one that must never, under any circumstances, be allowed to fall into enemy hands. At first, the fuse was used only over the sea, to protect its secret should a shell fail to detonate. But when the V-1 assault began, the decision was made to deploy it against the new threat. The risk was immense, but the alternative was unthinkable. The first proximity-fused shells were issued to coastal gun batteries within days. Almost overnight, results transformed. Where once it had taken thousands of rounds to bring down a single flying bomb, now only a fraction were needed. Gun crews who had spent weeks firing in frustration suddenly found their targets erupting in midair with astonishing precision. One British officer described it in his report. "Our shells seemed to find the bombs as if guided by some unseen hand." By late July, the effect was unmistakable. Entire waves of V-1s were being destroyed before reaching the city. The kill rate rose from a meager few percent to more than half, and soon even higher. Londoners began to notice that the terrifying droning sounds, once constant, were fading from the sky. No one outside the chain of command knew exactly why. The newspapers reported that British gunners had improved their aim. In truth, the improvement was not in human skill but in human ingenuity, in the delicate pulse of a tiny circuit, deep within a shell that could think for itself. As the summer waned and the Allies marched deeper into Europe, the V-1 threat slowly diminished. But the lessons of that desperate defense had only just begun. For in the struggle against the flying bombs, mankind had stumbled upon something profound. A glimpse of warfare's future in which machines could sense, decide, and act faster than any human mind. In the months to come, that discovery would change not just the battle for Britain, but the fate of the entire war. Late August 1944. Dawn breaks over the fields of northern France, where German observers from Flak Regiment 155W scan the skies above the Channel. The world is quiet but tense. Through their field glasses, they watch the black arcs of anti-aircraft fire bloom along the horizon, tiny blossoms of smoke against the pale morning light. Each detonation is distant, faint, almost beautiful. Yet what they witness defies everything they know about physics, about war, about probability itself. For weeks, they have tracked the flight of their vengeance weapons. Thousands of V-1 flying bombs launched toward London, the Reich's final promise of retribution. But something is happening that no one at Peenemünde or the Luftwaffe's scientific command can explain. The flying bombs are being destroyed, not by daring fighter pilots intercepting them at impossible speeds, not by barrage balloons tearing their wings apart, but by gunfire of uncanny precision. Shells detonate not on the target, but around it, forming invisible cages of destruction in the air. Dozens of V-1s vanish in bursts of orange flame long before reaching the coast. The morning report on the desk of Colonel Max Wachtel, commander of the V-1 offensive, is impossible to accept. 82% of all flying bombs launched that week have failed to reach their targets. He reads the number again, thinking it must be a clerical error. It violates every law of ballistics, every principle of probability known to German science. 82% destroyed. Such a figure should not exist. The data pours in from forward observers, radar plots, and impact studies. Test firings show nothing wrong with the missiles themselves. Engines function. Guidance systems perform normally. Yet against British defenses, they are falling from the sky as if hunted by an invisible force. At Peenemünde, engineers recheck their equations. Dr. Robert Lusser, designer of the V-1's control system, calculates that the odds of a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell on a target moving at 640 kilometers per hour are less than 1 in 10,000. The statistics, the mathematics, the engineering, all insist that what is being reported from France cannot be happening. And yet it is. German intelligence analysts propose explanations. Perhaps the British have developed a new radar system, or faster time-fused shells, or even radio-controlled guns. But none of these account for the scale of destruction. Something entirely new must be at work, something beyond their understanding. Across the Channel, the truth is hidden behind layers of secrecy thicker than steel. At the Royal Artillery Command posts, operators now rely on a weapon so classified that only a handful of officers know what it truly does. Every shell is counted. Every dud is retrieved or destroyed. The men who load them are told only this: never allow one to fall into enemy hands. Inside each shell lies a miracle of wartime ingenuity. The proximity fuse, known to the Allies as the VT, or variable time fuse. A deliberately misleading name meant to conceal its true nature. Within the fuse, a miniature radio transmitter emits a signal as the shell spins through the air. When the signal reflects off a nearby object, an aircraft, a flying bomb, even a thin metal wing, the returning echo alters the circuit's balance. Instantly, a tiny vacuum tube responds, closing a circuit that detonates the shell in midair. It is as though the shell knows when to explode. Such precision demands perfection in every detail. The internal components must survive forces of more than 20,000 times the pull of gravity when fired from a gun. The vacuum tubes must not shatter. The batteries must remain inert for years, yet awaken the instant the gun's shockwave triggers them. The circuitry must function at supersonic speed, in temperatures ranging from freezing to flame. Every one of these challenges had once been thought impossible. In 1939, even German scientists studying captured fragments of Allied shells had dismissed the concept of a radio fuse as fantasy. Miniaturized electronics cannot survive firing, one Peenemünde report concluded. No known material can protect such delicate components. But in America, those impossibilities had been conquered. At the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, under the leadership of physicist Dr. Merle Tuve, teams of engineers and mathematicians had worked day and night to make the proximity fuse real. They solved problems one by one, reinforcing tubes with new alloys, developing collapsible circuits, inventing batteries that activated chemically upon firing. Factories across the United States were transformed. Crossley Corporation, once a manufacturer of radios and refrigerators, now produced tens of thousands of fuses each day. Sylvania Electric and Western Electric contributed millions of miniature vacuum tubes, ruggedized to endure the unimaginable. By the summer of 1944, American industry was producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. The cost of a single fuse, once $700, had fallen to less than $20. Over $1 billion had already been spent, an astronomical figure, yet one justified by results. The secret was shared only with Britain, and only under the strictest conditions. When the first shipments arrived, guarded by armed convoys, the fuses were handled as though they were jewels, or bombs. Few artillerymen ever saw the inside of one. Those who did were sworn to silence. In the field, the results were astonishing. The proximity fuse did not simply increase accuracy. It transformed the mathematics of warfare. Before its introduction, an anti-aircraft battery might fire 2,000 shells to bring down a single aircraft. With the VT fuse, that number dropped to fewer than 100. Near misses became kills. Every shell that passed close to its target could now destroy it. To the gunners stationed along the British coast, it felt almost supernatural. They fired as usual, but suddenly their targets vanished in fireballs with uncanny regularity. Even hardened veterans whispered that the guns were now thinking for themselves. At the German command post in France, such reports reached the ears of bewildered officers. Wachtel's staff theorized that the British had somehow found a way to guide their shells remotely, perhaps by radar or magnetism or some mysterious new science. Engineers debated endlessly. None imagined the truth, that each shell contained its own radio brain, no larger than a man's thumb, capable of sensing and deciding in the blink of an eye. And so, as the summer waned, the numbers became undeniable. In June, 17% of V-1s were destroyed by gunfire. In July, that figure rose to 74%, and on one extraordinary day in late August, 82% of every missile launched toward London was obliterated before reaching its target. From the airfields of northern France, launch crews watched helplessly as their weapons vanished into plumes of smoke over the Channel. They had no explanation, only the knowledge that their once feared machines were being slaughtered by unseen hands. For the men of Flak Regiment 155W, it was a mathematical impossibility, a scientific absurdity. Yet, for the people of London, it was salvation. The invisible curtain of explosions high above the coast was the shield that kept their city alive. And all of it, every intercepted bomb, every spared life, was owed to the pulse of a tiny radio signal, deep inside a shell that no German scientist believed could exist. By early September 1944, the Battle of the Flying Bombs was all but over. What had begun as Hitler's bold gamble to terrify Britain into submission had ended in quiet defeat, not through armies or generals, but through circuitry no larger than a coin. On the French coast, launch sites lay abandoned. The concrete ramps of the V-1 batteries stood silent amid the heather, their catapults pointing uselessly toward the sea. German engineers packed their blueprints, their measurements, their calculations. None of it mattered anymore. Their vengeance weapons, once symbols of technological supremacy, had been rendered obsolete in mere weeks by something they could not even comprehend. Colonel Max Wachtel, who had commanded the entire V-1 campaign, stared at his reports in disbelief. The numbers had become unbearable to read. Out of every 100 bombs launched, more than 80 never reached England. He ordered inspections, demanded explanations, and even suspected sabotage. But there was nothing wrong with the V-1s. Engines ran smoothly. Guidance gyros performed perfectly. The fault, it seemed, lay not in the weapon, but in the world itself. German scientists debated late into the night. Some suggested that the British had developed ultra-fast mechanical fuses. Others believed they had somehow linked radar to the guns themselves, automating the process of fire. Yet none could explain the timing, the precision, the impossible proximity of the detonations. They were searching for a secret they had already dismissed years before, a technology they had deemed impossible. And so, in the bunkers of Peenemünde, defeat began not on the battlefield, but in the mind. Across the Channel, at Anti-Aircraft Command Headquarters, the atmosphere was very different. Reports of success poured in hourly. The gunners along the south coast, men who only weeks earlier had watched helplessly as V-1s thundered past, now saw them vanish in midair, one after another. Radar operators described the spectacle as a kind of storm made of light and sound, a chain of detonations racing across the sky. By then, the British had reorganized their entire defense network. The heavy guns, guided by American-built SCR-584 radar, formed a dense belt of fire stretching from Dover to Portsmouth. The radar automatically tracked each incoming target, computing range and bearing in fractions of a second, feeding firing solutions directly to the gun emplacements. Now, when the shells were fired, they carried within them the Allies' greatest secret, the proximity fuse. Each round transmitted its own invisible signal into the air, listening for its echo. This was the birth of true electronic warfare, a weapon that could sense its enemy. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse was absolute. Not even the men who fired the guns fully understood what they were using. Each crate of ammunition was tracked, each shell counted. Duds were to be destroyed immediately. naval patrols swept the channel daily to ensure no unfired fuse drifted into enemy hands. So strict was the secrecy that the technology was forbidden for use on land until the winter of 1944. Command feared that if the Germans captured even one intact example, they might reverse engineer it. Thousands of soldiers would die in Europe's fields and forests before the proximity fuse was finally authorized for ground artillery. A tragic but necessary cost to preserve the secret. For the people of London, the results were unmistakable. The steady droning of the V-1s grew rarer, the explosions fewer. The skies that had once echoed with engines and fear were now strangely peaceful. By the end of August, only a handful of the flying bombs were slipping through. Of the 9,521 V-1s launched from France, barely a quarter reached their targets. The campaign that had once promised to cripple Britain now barely scratched its surface. General Frederick Pyle, commander of Britain's anti-aircraft defenses, later estimated that without the proximity fuse, casualties from the V-1 attacks would have been 4 or 5 times higher. The fuse, he said simply, had saved London. For Germany, the cost of failure was immense. Over 25,000 V-1s were built during the war, each consuming scarce resources, each manufactured by forced laborers in underground tunnels at Mittelwerk and other hidden factories. Tens of thousands of prisoners perished building Hitler's vengeance weapons, dying for a project that achieved nothing. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American factories were producing life-saving technology on an unimaginable scale. The proximity fuse was not the work of a single inventor or laboratory, but of an entire nation's industry. 110 factories worked in concert, employing over 80,000 people. Many of them were women, young, determined, and unaware of what they were creating. At Sylvania Electric's plant in Massachusetts, 5,000 women assembled delicate tubes and circuits for 12 hours a day. At Crossley Corporation in Ohio, 10,000 workers turned out 16,000 fuses daily. They were told only that their work was vital to the war effort. Only after the war would they learn the truth, that their hands had built the tiny brains that stopped Hitler-ISA vengeance in midair. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied scientists revealed the secret to their counterparts. In interrogation rooms, captured German engineers stared in disbelief as American officers demonstrated the proximity fuse. When told it had been in mass production since 1943, they refused to believe it. They examined the small glass tubes, the circuits, the impossibly rugged components, and shook their heads. They had dismissed the idea as fantasy, and lost a war because of it. Dr. Merle Tuve, who had led the project, reflected later that the fuse's success came not from genius alone, but from collaboration. Scientists, engineers, and factory workers united in a common cause. What totalitarianism could not do, he said, free cooperation accomplished. It was a victory of democracy's industry over dictatorship's arrogance. By war's end, over 22 million proximity fuses had been produced. Their cost exceeded $1 billion, but their impact was incalculable. They had defended London, protected ships in the Pacific, and saved countless lives on the ground in Europe. When the War Department finally declassified the project in September 1945, its statement was brief and understated. One of the most important weapons developed during the war, surpassed in effectiveness only by the atomic bomb. For the German scientists who had struggled to understand how their perfect weapons were being destroyed, the revelation was both awe-inspiring and humiliating. They had been defeated not by bravery or strategy, but by an idea, by the belief that impossible problems could be solved when a free people worked together. In the end, the proximity fuse was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of what science could achieve when driven by necessity, guided by freedom, and multiplied by industry. On that extraordinary day in late August 1944, when 82% of the V-1s fell from the sky, the world changed. The age of electronic warfare had begun. For the people of London, it meant survival. For the men who built it, it meant victory. And for the German officers who watched their flying bombs vanish into the clouds, it meant only mystery. A mystery they would not understand until it was far too late. The proximity fuse did not roar or flash or thunder. Its power lay in silence, in invisible signals whispered through the air, in circuits no larger than a fingernail. Yet in that silence it saved a city, and perhaps it saved the future.